Okay, it is time to begin. So we are. So welcome to the DIEM BOF, the digital emblem BOF. And next slide. Like all IETF sessions, this is the note well. Please make sure you understand your responsibilities in order to contribute. You should please review this if this is your first time at an IETF meeting. Next slide. So please pay attention to the code of conduct. It's okay to attack a bad idea. It's not okay to attack the person delivering it. And Eric wanted to say a few words about the conduct here.
Hoping that, yeah, it works. So my name is Eric Vink. I'm the responsible AD for this BOF. And as this BOF attracts a diverse community of people, some of them have never been at the IETF, working for very vastly different organizations. I would love to insist on a note well. Please be welcoming. Understand that there could be misunderstanding because words are different in some organizations. So let's be open and welcoming to those people. That's all. And thank you for the chair.
Thank you. Next slide. So a few tips for people who might not have been in meetings using Meetico before. We're going to use the raise hand in the Meetico for the mic line. And then when you get to the front of the mic line, go to one of the mics. This allows remote participants to join the queue fairly. If you are a remote participant, please make sure your video and audio are turned off unless you're speaking. And we recommend a headset. It does help. Next slide. So let's talk about the goals and non-goals of today's session. The idea is to understand the problem before us. That means use cases, scope, and understand where we have agreements and disagreements. Not to sort them out, but understand where they are. Non-goals, we're not chartering a working group. This is a non-working group forming BOF. We're not trying to design the protocol here today. We're trying to decide whether we understand the problem and the IETF is the right place to work on it. If the answer to both of those is yes, then we can move to working on a charter for next meeting. Next slide. This is the agenda we've laid out. The intent is to have discussions of the problem statement, discussions of what a solution might look like, and then a lot of open discussion. We have tried to make lots of time to hear each other. Then at the end, we'll try and answer those two questions. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Timo.
Thank you. I'm Timo Schles. For those that do not know me, and also part of the reason why I'm here to kick off with part of what we see as a problem to be solved is I'm in the military, the Royal Netherlands Air Force to be precise, having 30 years of experience with both boots on the ground and commanding positions, but I've also background in interoperability and standardization of communications protocols within NATO. One venture that is basically a split off from my work and work of others in this field is White Flag. And White Flag is both a foundation as well as an ecosystem of NGOs, militaries, and others to build a communications protocol to overcome certain problems we face in the real world, to be precise, in conflict areas and disaster areas. So White Flag is a communications protocol. It works technically. We think it's currently at technology readiness level 6. So we're starting operational pilots now with certain parties, for example, with Save the Children in South Sudan, and we're also working with the Japanese Red Cross on some use cases. So that's the background, and please, next slide. I will try to get you into the problem space. So what we try to do here is basically to prevent loss of lives in disaster and conflict areas around the globe, because lack of information, and I think Mike, the next speaker, will have a perfect example of this. Lack of information leads to casualties and civilian harm. In many cases, press, medical workers, medical convoys, and so forth. And this is recognized widely. There's lots of research that has been recognized up to the level of the Secretary General of the UN, who actually called for action here. And next one, please. So in conflict and disaster areas, many things happen. And many of this information is not communicated to the right persons. I will not go into details here, but just to give you an impression of what the symbols and signs that we're currently digitizing with white flag. Next one, please. So we're used to physical signs, but they have severe limitations. They cannot selectively be shared. Often you want certain people to know that you're there, but you don't want others to know. They're hard to authenticate, hard to see in many situations, but also hard to process by automated systems. And especially with intelligent systems becoming more available, it's very important that we take those into account as well. And last but not least, if something goes wrong, accountability is very hard, because it's hard to reconstruct what actually happened and what information was actually available at the time. Next one, please. So that's why we started working on what we call digital signs and signals, but you can use the term digital emblems as well. Enhanced security, having signs that you don't have to put on the object itself because it's digital, it can live somewhere else. Can be used real time to multiple stakeholders in a selective way. And you can support many types of objects. Physical, like cars, vehicles, buildings, people, but also virtual, of course, and events. What happened to a specific entity. And processing by automated systems is of course way easier when something is digital rather than a physical sign. But there are also challenges, of course. Trust, which is not a technical thing. That's really a human dimension, if you will, that plays here. How do you bind the digital sign to an object? Interoperability, and that's, I guess, a key question here as well. If we have different standards here to do this, then we still not achieve what we need to achieve here. And there's a diversity of use cases. So even within conflicts, one conflict is not the same as another conflict. So signs might be used differently in different conflicts. But the use case of, let's say, in disaster areas, again, is different from use cases in conflict areas. But there are many similarities. And personally, I think there is good work to be done here to try to find the common ground and work towards standardization. Thank you. Hopefully, within the 5 minutes I got. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. We have a minute for clarifying questions if anyone has some. Yeah. Okay, we have a few in the queue. I'm going to close it because we do want to stay on time, but let's go through these three questions. People, Michael?
I'm not asking a question, but I'll be the next speaker. So please move on, Russ.
Yeah. Okay. Sami.
Timo, thank you so much for your presentation. Can everyone hear me? Yeah?
Yes, go
Yeah,
ahead.
thanks for your presentation. Just a really quick question. I saw on the slide where you said you were working with different organizations and you had the red crescent there. And then you also had the civil defense emblem, and you also had the blue shield, the UNESCO protective emblem. So can you speak a bit about the work that you've done with those, like, so which Red Crescent organizations, which civil defense organizations? That's just
So we haven't worked with all the people that use the signs that are up there, but we have been working with the ICRC, for example, the Japanese Red Cross. We're working with Save the Children currently, but we're also talking to tech organizations. Startups are, we have one startup building software right now, but we're also having discussions with, for example, the European Space Agency on how this might help with their work, what they can see with remote sensing and how what they see can communicate it to others. So, and that's all in different stages with different use cases. Does that answer the question? Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mauro.
Yeah, hello everyone. So my name is Mauro Vignati. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. So hello, Timo. So we follow white flag since a while now. I would like just to give a couple of detail on what Timo said, because we have to better understand what we're talking about here. So when we talk about the slide that Timo showed about the sign that cannot be selectively shared and so on. So just to be precise, so we, as the other humanitarian organization, as the UN, other humanitarian on the ground, so there are several ways to communicate the positions of our assets and our personnel. So the first communication is through a radio channel with the armed forces of both sides. With the email is another solution, with direct contact with the command and control of the army. So there are different layer of communication. So we consider white flag an interesting project for redundancy, but we can select which partner we would like to communicate the position of our asset and people. On the second point, cannot be authenticated.
So Mauro, I'm going to have to cut you here.
Yeah.
Can you hold this for the open discussion later on?
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, I will.
Thank you. We're trying to keep the section very, very tight.
Thank you.
So we've cut the lines now. Thanks, Timo. We're going to throw to Mike Christie, who is remote, and I'll grab his presentation. And
Great.
all yours, Mike.
You have control
Great.
of the slides.
Well, I hope everybody can hear me. I wanted to be with you all today in Vancouver, but I got trapped by some weather-related cancellations. So unfortunately, perhaps next time. My name is Mike Christie. I'm a 30-year-plus veteran of Reuters news agency who left at the start of this year to set up my own consultancy. I've been a correspondent, bureau chief, senior editorial manager on 5 continents, covered wars, conflicts, disasters. In my last 9 years at Reuters, I ran editorial safety globally. So I was responsible for protecting 4,000 staff and freelance journalists against physical, digital, and emotional threats. I was also a board member of some industry organizations like the International News Safety Institute and the ACOS Alliance for Freelance Journalists. I'm also well connected with other sort of journalist safety bodies like the CPJ, and I'm keeping them kind of in the loop on this conversation. This conversation about digital emblems is potentially of enormous importance for international news media. If you could move to the second slide, please. Oh, 1 second.
You have control of the slides?
I think you do, actually, right?
No, we gave it to you. We can
That's all
take
right.
it back if we need to.
I've moved it forward anyway.
Okay. The conversation taking place about digital emblems is potentially of enormous importance for the international news media from a safety perspective. I mean, as we understand it, at the most basic level, we're talking about press signs that we Velcro on our flak vests in war zones, or the TV signs that we put on the sides of and roofs of armored cars and other vehicles that we use in battlefronts, and often with duct tape in the physical world. Could you move to the next slide, please? Here's a real world example. I could give you dozens like this. I'm sorry, let me try to. Here's a real world example. I could give you dozens like this. In August 2005, the Reuters Bureau in Baghdad heard reports of an insurgent attack on a police station and a US military checkpoint. The insurgency in Iraq was escalating after the 2003 invasion, and attacks like these were big news stories. So the Bureau sent driver Walid Khaled and TV cameraman Haider Kadam to the scene to report. As they approached in their car, the car was unmarked, but the journalists were wearing, press badges on their flak vests, and they had IDs as well, Reuters IDs and US military IDs. But as they approached this checkpoint, the US soldiers opened fire. Walid died. He was one of 7 journalists that Reuters lost in Iraq between 2003 and 2011. Half of them were killed by US soldiers. Haider was badly wounded. A digital version of this press badge, something as simple as what we put on our flak jackets, but a digital version of that could perhaps be seen or integrated into a battlefield GIS system, and thus perceived from a greater distance, maybe over the hill at night. It could have potentially made a difference in this case and saved Walid's life. And as I say, I could give you dozens of examples of that. Another way, that potentially a digital emblem could be used to cover people is via vehicles. What you see here on the slide is an old Reuters armored Land Rover, nicknamed Tarzan by my colleagues at Reuters, who used it mainly in the Middle East. The vehicle has actually been donated to the Imperial War Museum in London, and it's now on exhibit. So if you're curious, you can have a look at it the next time you're there. In August 2006 in Gaza, Tarzan was struck by a missile fired from an Israeli helicopter, despite the copious old school physical emblems that you see on the vehicle there in the photo. 2 of our colleagues were wounded. A digitized version of the emblems could have been more visible and provided more protection. Could you move to the next slide, please? There's another way in which this could be of enormous consequence and benefit to news media. We carry a lot of equipment, TV equipment, photo equipment, technology, communications gear, sat phones, Starlinks these days, and personal protective equipment when we cross borders. And the paperwork involved in managing carnets, export licenses, and other customs bureaucracy is a real nightmare for journalists. Journalists do not do bureaucracy particularly well. To give you an idea of the scale of this, and hence the photo of the Olympics there, the photo itself is of Tokyo. But to give you an idea of what's happening with the games in Paris that are about to kick off, an international news agency like Reuters will perhaps have 80 or more photographers. Each of them will be carrying probably $25,000 worth of camera bodies and lenses. Many of them will also have soft armor, rifle plates, ballistic helmets, gas masks, just in case there are outbreaks of protest or militant attacks. We may also borrow a couple $1 million worth of specialized lenses from the likes of Canon to supplement our normal stock for such a big sporting event. In addition to visuals, gear, and PPE, personal protective equipment, the technology and logistics teams of a news agency like Reuters will have maybe a couple of tons of computer server equipment for the newsroom that we're going to establish in the main press center, and for robotics that we put in the stadiums, at the events. It is not unusual for photographers involved in robotics to arrive at an event like this with 18 Pelican cases. All of this pales in comparison to the amount of gear that a major rights-holding broadcaster like the BBC or NBC has to bring into such events. Being able to replace, sheaves, folders full of customs-related paperwork with a QR code, maybe linking to information that can be, detailed and updated on a laptop, would free up so much effort, time, and resources that we really want to spend on the news event itself. And also, there are a lot of liability issues there connected to poorly filled in paperwork. There are lots of other aspects, of this discussion regarding journalist safety, media logistics that I could talk about, but 5 minutes isn't an awful lot of time. But I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Are there any clarifying questions, not commentary? Okay, thank you. Next speaker. While we're waiting for the next speaker to set up, there's some slides have been sent to the mail list, linked to them from Rohan, who talked about his experiences dealing with some of this.
So first of all, thank you so much to all of you for this opportunity to be here. I think it's something that's really different for the International Committee of the Red Cross. I apologize in advance for any growing pains that I might have or my colleague Mauro I have on the process. But really, we're so happy to be here to talk to you a bit about the Digital Emblem project that the ICRC has been working on since 2020. So the project to digitalize the Red Cross, Crescent, and Crystal is really about the issue of we do not have a way today of identifying specific protections in international humanitarian law in cyberspace. And so I'll explain the digital side of it in a couple of minutes, but I really want to start with explaining what exactly the distinctive emblem is, because it is really something very unique, very idiosyncratic. So I really want everyone to kind of understand the breadth of this notion of the distinctive emblem. Next slide, please. So this mosaic hopefully will give you a little bit of an introduction as to, like I said, the breadth of this concept of a distinctive emblem. And I'll say at the outset that the primary user of the distinctive emblem of the Red Cross, Crescent, and Crystal, so I say distinctive emblem because it's the distinctive emblem of the Geneva Conventions, the primary user is actually states. It's not the International Committee of the Red Cross or other components of the movement that I'll talk about later. So if you look at the top here, you see images, for example, of persons in combat fatigues in uniform. They obviously don't work for the ICRC. They are members of the medical services of the armed forces, right? And so the emblem is used to signify specific protections that those persons have. It doesn't signify their affiliation with any movement or where they work or anything like that. It just signifies that they have specific protections. The next image, the black and white image, is an image from the landing on the beaches in Normandy, right, from the Second World War. And again, you see war surgeons bearing the Red Cross, the distinctive emblem of the Geneva Conventions, to identify the specific protections that they have. You'll see that the emblem can be used on vehicles, it's used on ships, it can be put on the top of hospitals, so military hospitals, also civilian hospitals, and then it's also used by certain national societies. So here you see, I think it's the German Red Cross and the Turkish Red Crescent. The ICRC uses the protective emblem at all times, so you'll see the picture with the emblem at the top of our headquarters in Geneva. The bottom picture is how the ICRC uses, the bottom middle picture is how the ICRC uses the emblem on the field. This picture is kind of important to me because actually that's a picture of me in my past life when I worked on the field with the ICRC, and I benefited from the specific protections that I'm talking about, and so was entitled to use the Red Cross emblem. Next slide. So I really want to just take maybe 2 minutes and oh, sorry, we can skip this slide. So this is just some information, kind of like giving you the breadth of how the emblem is used. I mean, it's, you know, there's over 120 armed conflicts worldwide that involve over 60 states and 120 non-state armed groups. So they're all entitled for their military, medical military services, civilian medical services. They're entitled to use the emblem, all parties to armed conflict. But maybe you can look at that information later because I really want to move to the next slide, which explains what is so different about the emblem. So when we think of an emblem, we usually think of a logo, right? Or we think of something that provides some information about affiliation. So if we look at the emblem of Wayne Enterprises, right? So you know that, you know, the emblem of Wayne Enterprises, you see it, and so you know that this object either belongs to Wayne Enterprises or is somehow related to Wayne Enterprises. If you see, I don't know, an emblem of the radioactive symbol, then you know that whatever's inside of that thing maybe is radioactive and it has to be treated in a specific way. But in any case, an emblem can be used to inform, provide some information of affiliation. And the emblem is used that way as a logo. So it does have that function. We call that in international law, because that's how it's framed in international humanitarian law, an indicative use. So indicative emblem is kind of like a fancy way of saying a logo, essentially. And so it shows affiliation with the movement. And in that way, it can be used primarily by what we call national societies like the American Red Cross or the German Red Cross or the Turkish Red Crescent, by the ICRC and by the Federation. But what's more important, particularly for this process of digitalizing the emblem, is the protective use, right? So it's a completely different use, the protective use of the emblem. And with the protective use of the emblem, signals or indicates is actually not affiliation with any one or any state or any government or any enterprise or anything like that. It doesn't indicate any kind of affiliation. What it indicates is a specific protection in international humanitarian law. And so for the medical services, we call that protection respecting and protecting. It's a positive obligation that parties to conflict have to treat the medical services and certain humanitarian operations in a certain way. And so the ICRC uses the protective emblem at all times. What we call the International Federation of the Red Cross, which I can explain that a bit later, uses the protective emblem at all times. And then all of those images I showed you earlier of the military using the emblem or the civilian hospitals in times of armed conflict using the emblem, that is the protective use. So a party to armed conflict, when they see that emblem, they have no idea what the affiliation is. Maybe it's a chaplain, like a religious chaplain, maybe it's the medical services, maybe it's the ICRC, maybe it's the Federation, maybe it's the National Society using the emblem for protective purposes because they're, undertaking some medical function. They don't actually know. They can't actually affiliate the emblem with any one entity. But what they know is that they have to act in a certain way. And in that sense, it's more like a stop sign or a traffic light. What it indicates is a specific obligation of a party to conflict. And that party has to act in a certain way that is absolutely not just, we cannot target this thing. It's a positive obligation to respect and protect, an obligation that has existed for 160 years and really forms sort of the basis of international humanitarian law. I mean, if we look at the history of IHL, international humanitarian law, it really started as this idea that you have the medical services, you have medical functions, and there has to be a way of identifying the specific protection of those medical functions, and then, of course, also certain humanitarian functions. And that's so kind of a bit of a story of this notion of this protective use of the emblem. And then the emblem also has a purpose that's related to this protective function, which is really to assist, right? Because the emblem also indicates to persons, imagine you're in an armed conflict and you see a red crescent or a red cross or a red crystal, you know that, you don't know that that entity is necessarily the government or an armed group or the ICRC or the Federation or someone else, as I mentioned earlier, but you know that if you go there, you might be protected. And in that sense, it's a bit like this emblem of a fire escape, right? So if you see a fire escape, you know that if there's a fire, you can go there and you're more likely to be safe. And for a fire escape to work, there has to be very specific rules related to how that fire escape is used. How big is the emblem? Where is it placed? How many of them are there? There are laws that control, the different sort of dimensions of that emblem. And the Red Cross, Crescent, and Crystals are very much like that. So they're regulated by international humanitarian law, and they themselves indicate a specific protection in international humanitarian law. So when we think about what might be orthogonal to this discussion, because that word might come up, when we think of what might be not related to discussion, we have to think about a stop sign or a traffic light. In a situation of armed conflict where there are no laws that say you actually have to stop at a stop sign, the stop sign would be pretty much useless. And because a stop sign is meant to indicate an obligation that you as a driver have to stop at an intersection. And so that's kind of like an explanation of the uniqueness of the distinctive emblem. Next slide. Okay, so just very quickly now, because I only have about a minute, why are we at the IETF? So the reality is that today, cyber operations are part and parcel of armed conflict, right? So parties to armed conflict engage in cyber operations against each other and sometimes even target civilian populations. When international humanitarian law was conceived, it was conceived with, there are medical services and there are certain humanitarian operations that must be respected and protected by parties to conflict. All states of the world are party to the Geneva Convention. Every single state is party to the Geneva Conventions. Every single state agrees that the medical services and certain humanitarian operations must be respected and protected. But there is no way of indicating that protection in cyberspace, because when the Geneva Conventions were conceived, of course, there was no cyberspace. And so the Digital Emblem Project is seeking to take the distinctive emblem and reflect it in cyberspace. That's it. It's not trying to change the distinctive emblem. The distinctive emblem works. It's worked for 160 years. We're not trying to change that. And our goal today is to use the standardization process and to take a product and to bring it to states and say, you need to incorporate this into international humanitarian law or adopt it in a way that it can be used in situations of armed conflict to indicate these protections. Sorry, I went over time. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions.
Okay, a couple of, I hope, clarifying questions. Yes, Rohan.
Yes. Hi, Rowan May. So yes, my understanding is when you say the digital emblem, you mean this specific digital emblem, which is a digital emblem.
Yeah, that's right. So
The one specified in the Geneva Conventions.
That's right. So
Okay,
indeed,
yeah,
we can
thanks.
talk about, like, when I talk about digital emblem, because we have the digital emblem project.
Yeah, you just sort of misused the emblems, in a way where you mean this specific emblem, not all emblems.
I'm sorry that you feel that I misused it. So there's something called the distinctive emblem of the Geneva Conventions. When I, as ICRC, talk about the distinctive emblem, I'm talking about, when I talk about the digital emblem, I'm talking about the digital distinctive emblem. So if that was unclear to you, I'm glad that that's clear. But the project is called the Digital Emblem Project.
You used it without the full official.
So I'm clarifying that for you now, but I'll continue to do that because that's the name of the project. Kind of an odd question.
Go ahead, Watson.
Oh, Watson Ladd, Akamai. So just to really simplify the point, and maybe to the point of absurdity, you're asking for something that, say, an MRI machine can put out on all its connections saying, I'm an MRI machine, don't hack me.
I'm really sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Okay. I'm asking, basically, you want an emblem, some way for a computer that shouldn't be interfered with, because it's, say, running an MRI machine, or it's a hospital's system where patient records are stored, to indicate that it's that it serves a humanitarian purpose and should not be interfered with by cyber operations.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. So basically, when I talked about that obligation to respect and protect, what we really mean is that the medical services themselves, like the work of the medical services, the work of certain humanitarian organizations, need to be respected and protected. So just giving you an example, if you have malicious software that, I don't know, disables medical equipment like an MRI machine, indeed, this could potentially be a violation of international humanitarian law, because if it's done by a party to conflict, because they're not respecting and protecting the medical services. If they have an operation that deletes patient data, this would be a violation of respect and protect. So I think I understand your question, but if not, please feel free to clarify a little bit more. But okay, I think that's clear. Yeah.
Samit, thank you and welcome to the IETF.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. My question is one of scope for you. You've talked, about protection of cyber assets. Do you also see room here to protect physical assets with a digital emblem?
So, and I think it's important to be really clear on this, and I'm happy to go into more detail during the discussion. So, but thank you for your question. This project is for digital infrastructure. It's for digital assets. The ICRC has engaged in the process of looking at part of our role is the development of international humanitarian law. And where we see lacuna, we indeed work on projects to fix those lacuna. We have not identified any lacuna with the physical emblem. In fact, we see dangers in moving towards a project that creates an enhanced emblem or something like that. The emblem works. It has worked for 160 years, and nothing in our analysis today is leading us to say we need to change this analysis. So this project and the work that ICRC is doing is strictly limited to digital infrastructure. Thank you for your question.
Jim Reed speaking for myself. I think this is a great idea and we should do what we possibly can to help out. I think this is a great initiative. My question though is about the issues of these emblems. It's fairly clear when you're talking about the stuff to do with the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, that there's an agency responsible for essentially registering those particular emblems and we can make use of them. But for any of the other emblems that you were talking about earlier on, what would be the authority for that particular emblem, would be the registry for it, so that we would then know how to interact with them to say this really is the genuine emblem, let's say for an emergency exit sign or whatever. Where would we go to get that kind of information and verify it before it can be put into some kind of internet resource?
Yeah, so with regards to the emblems that we saw earlier on, we'd have to parse through them a little bit because some of them are IHL emblems, the one I mentioned. So there was civil defense, I believe there was a UNESCO emblem, there was a Red Crescent, and I don't know what, but anyways, there's a couple of emblems that are indeed IHL emblems, and each of them has different specific protections. I'm talking now about the specific protections for medical and humanitarian because that's a Red Cross, Crescent, and Citadel, but there are indeed other emblems. There's also another emblem for what we call dangerous forces, which are all under IHL. As I mentioned, mentioned, the ICRC is kind of what we call the guardians of international humanitarian law. Our role, and it has been for the last 160 years, is to really see where there are lacuna in the law and promote an understanding, a dissemination of international humanitarian law, and then a development of international humanitarian law. So when it comes to the IHL emblems, the ICRC would then, of course, bring things to states. That's what we're going to be doing later this year at the international conference. There's an international conference that takes place once every 4 years that brings together all the states that are party to the Geneva Conventions, where the ICRC will present issues that we see with the law. And one of the issues that we're presenting is indeed on this project, on the Digital Emblem project. But for now, the project is limited to the Red Cross, Crescent, and Crystal. That doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be enlarged to the other emblems of IHL. But for all the other emblems, the ICRC is not involved.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
So we're going to move on to the section now that is going to paint a view of what solution space might look like, just to make sure we have current common understanding of the space. So go ahead, Felix.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So we've been working on digital emblems, as just explained by Samit, for a couple of years now together with the ICRC, and I'd like to talk about the technical aspects of them. In particular, I hope I can show that we think the problem is well understood and that it is solvable. Next slide, please. So as Samit just said, and I have a response to one of the questions. So Samit showed you how physical emblems are applied to physical assets nowadays. What we want to do or what we seek is a digital equivalent to the Red Cross in this sense. We want a digital emblem applied to digital assets, for example, a hospital's database. Next slide, please. The purpose of such a digital emblem is to stop attacks. And to do so, we must show to what we call verifiers. Verifiers are all those parties who want to, for whatever reason, attack digital assets. Could be a ransomware gang, could be a state cyber command. As Samit just said, in this sense, the digital emblem works like a stop sign, and verifiers need to respect it in order for it to work. This means that verifiers must, that the digital emblem must meet the needs of verifiers. If they have no reason to look at it, or if it might hurt the operations, they will not do so, and it will not have an effect. This has important implications on our problem statement. We'll talk about that soon, but let me also highlight the use cases that we are looking at concretely. In general, we would like to apply a digital emblem to any kind of network endpoint. The first use case that comes to mind here are server endpoints, so any kind of web server, a database server, the obvious candidates. Secondly, we would also like to protect networks. We think that networks are a good solution to effectively protect two types of other endpoints, namely what we call constrained devices and personal devices. Constrained devices could be any medical equipment that is network connected. Personal devices could be network connected tablets or computers used by a hospital staff. Next slide, please. So we have identified a number of requirements for a digital emblem together with the ICRC, and I would like to highlight two that I think make the problem unique. The first one of them is that a digital emblem must be removable. This means that one should be able to remove an emblem at any time. We believe that in practice, digital emblems can help to reduce attacks on digital assets, but there might be scenarios in which the protective sign becomes a target sign. We want the asset holders to be able to decide whether an emblem is more a benefit or a risk for them, and whenever they decide that it's more a risk for them, they should be able to take it down. We think that it would be easiest to provide this requirement by having the asset holders distribute the emblems themselves. Secondly, there's the requirement of what we call covert inspection. This means that no one should be able to tell whether emblems are inspected. The idea here is to meet the needs of verifiers. Remember, verifiers are those parties that would like to attack digital assets, and you can think of this requirement as saying verifiers would not want to signal that they are attackers. That might hurt their operations, and if a digital emblem would require to signal this, they would likely not use it. One way to provide this for this requirement would be to distribute emblems without an explicit query for them. Taken together, our idea is that we put emblems where attackers look anyways. For example, we could embed emblems in responses to queries that have plausible deniability to be for something other than a digital emblem. We think that this is particularly challenging in this problem space because we first need to find such a place. And second, we don't want to break things. If you now put something in a response that actually has a different purpose, yeah, there's a risk associated with that. We believe that this distribution requires sanitization because we need to sneak it in somewhere. And we need to avoid any risks that come with it. And this is why we are at the IETF. That's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any clarifying questions.
Any questions, Felix? Clarifying questions only, please. Seeing none, I think we'll take Brian's presentation now. Thanks, Felix.
Right. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Haberman. I think some of you probably know me, but one of the things that really comes up in these conversations, I think Felix hit on it, these kinds of discussions have been going on for several years now. And I think one of the things that we've recognized from the work that we've been doing is just how broad the problem actually is. Next slide. So while we heard Sumit and Felix talk about protections under international humanitarian law, there are other instances where there are protections under other types of laws. What those protections are kind of orthogonal to this discussion. Really being able to display an emblem is necessary in order to get that protection, as was being said earlier. But there are also organizations that have to display emblems because they're required to. Again, kind of orthogonal to this discussion, but because they're required to display these emblems, what we have to look at is, as you move more towards digital capabilities, how do you give them the same capabilities in the digital space? And the gap that seems to be appearing over and over again is that secure real-time signaling of protections, because if you can't do that, then the people who are assets that are being protected aren't being protected in real time, and you have no way of really understanding what those protections are. Next slide. So one of the things that becomes really important here is understanding that even with physical emblems, you run into problems because you can literally paint things wherever you want. You can slap things on there, and if people are able to see it, they may not necessarily be able to verify it. So how is it that we can actually trust these emblems actually indicate what's going on? The other problem that we run into here is visibility. Typically, the physical emblems are something that people can see, but if you're looking at it from a different angle, you may not be able to recognize it. And it's actually really hard for systems to recognize these old physical symbols. So how can we actually do something that's going to protect these systems from new capabilities? One piece that I think is really important is the non-repudiation. Can you actually create a mechanism that allows people to say, no, you really did display that emblem, and this is when we saw it, so that people can't display it for nefarious purposes, take it down and claim that they never did it. So as these things kind of move along and you become more and more tied to a digital infrastructure, we need to start thinking about not only the digital assets that you want to protect, like your networks and your endpoints, but also how do you actually augment the capabilities that exist or that need to be in place for the physical emblems. Next slide, please. So in our work, what we've really done is kind of looked across the space of all of these types of use cases and said, are there pieces of commonality that we need to start considering if we were to do work in this space? Clearly authenticity becomes important. You want to make sure that you're actually looking at an emblem that has been verified or can be verified. Going back towards who actually gave approval, who displayed it, whatnot. The other part here is really being able to increase the visibility. Can you create a capability that allows people to feel more protected because they now have greater visibility into why they're being protected or why that signal exists? And then also being able to wrap in the ability to say, when did somebody display it? When did somebody not display it? And finally, you get to the point of, if someone has requested use of an emblem, been granted access, and then they've been found to abuse it, you want to be able to revoke it. So can you actually leverage capabilities that say you can no longer use this going forward? And when I think about these kinds of use cases and these kinds of needs, I see a lot of existing work in the IETF. We need to figure out what the actual requirements are and how do we actually leverage those building blocks to solve this problem rather than trying to create something brand new from scratch. So I believe that's it. Questions? All right, thank you.
Let's see, how do I get my hand up here?
Get to a floor mic, Brian.
Just a clarification question. Can we size this? Are we talking about millions or billions of unique digital IDs? Can we size this in any way in terms of the scale that we're dealing with? Is this, no, a million, is this a billion, a trillion? And that's what the extent of the question I'm asking.
Yeah. Brian, if you have an answer.
Bob, that's actually a really good question. I think right now we're talking about maybe thousands of organizations that would want to use these kinds of things. I think the scope really comes into how many people are actually observing these emblems, and can they actually do it in a scalable way without affecting the behavior or the activities of the device that's being protected by the emblem.
Well, thousands of organizations I can wrap my head around, but I'm trying to wrap my head around again is that how many of these things are out there or going to be out there in the next 10 years?
Bob?
And that's the question that I'm asking.
Oh, so Bob, I think what you'll hear from Bill will give you some scope on that.
10 to 100 million would be like a reasonable way of looking at it. Okay, do you want to start?
Right, so let me get slides up. Sorry.
And you're advancing. I just told you to advance. Okay. Yep. Howdy. I've been working with the team that's been doing use case interviews with the many different organizations that administer bodies of international law, and the way this has been scoped thus far is as markings that are required under international law. So, excellent. Okay, so the idea is that these supplement or perhaps eventually replace physical markings that are required under international law. So I'll give a couple examples of the physical markings. Going around from the top left in clockwise order, we've got obviously the press marking. The next one is the ISO standardized marking for an ISO container, cargo container. Every cargo container in the world has one of those. The United Nations blue helmets, which are, again, a protective marking under the Geneva Convention. Next one down is 4 different markings on a cardboard carton indicating components of chemical weapons. Next one down in the bottom corner there is marking on a wooden pallet. Every piece of wooden pallet, drayage, carton, whatever, that crosses an international border is required to be marked to show how it is not moving termites and other, bugs across borders. Next one is the blue and white shield of UNESCO for World Heritage Site. I think Timo mentioned that already. Next one, every piece of radioactive fuel or waste that crosses a national border has to be marked. So many of you have seen that marker. And the big orange bag there is a diplomatic pouch. Next slide. Drilling down a little bit more, next slide, on that one for the termites. The Food and Agriculture Organization is the international treaty organization that is responsible for this body of law. The law itself is the International Plant Protection Convention. And the specific law that requires the marking is the International Standards for Phytosanitary Measures, law number 15. So this has been 100% standardized since 1951, but it's standardized for physical display, not for digital display. And you can see a breakdown down there of the data that's being encoded. This is a hot metal brand that is stuck into a piece of wood with variable data in it to encode stuff, right? We know how to do variable data without using a brand. We know how to do it with digital bits. So next slide. So here's a structure that many of us think would work. You have an issuer, the person who's responsible for putting the mark on something. The digital emblem, which is a set of records that together comprise the mark. And they use a description to bind themselves to the asset. So we're not talking about the digital emblem being physically affixed to the asset. A representation of it could be affixed, but the digital emblem is a bunch of data. And so think about this like a URL. You can see a URL printed on a billboard. Somebody can copy that URL and put it on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt. They haven't destroyed or invalidated the website it refers to. Those are all just pointers that tell you how to get to the website. Copying the URL is not an attack against the website. It's just another instance of the pointer. Next slide. So who are validators? Who would validate this data? Next slide. We have the three really common cases and the one really uncommon case. The uncommon case in the top left is a loitering munition. Loitering munition might be trying to figure out what its target is. What is a valid target, not a valid target? But the really common use case, hundreds of times a second around the world, are customs agents. Customs agents trying to figure out whether something should pass or be inspected or be destroyed or whatever. Next slide. So there's that ISO container one again, right? The customs agent is looking at a container, but the interesting part of the container is that right there that says, you know, what the container is and how to identify it and how to match it up to tracking information. Next. So what problem are we solving? This is the real problem that we're solving with digital emblems, the proliferation of incompatible proprietary scanners. These are stacking up in customs agencies because people who have physical markings that are required under international law that they have to put on stuff, they understand that digitalization is needed. They understand digitalization is coming. They are doing the work to digitalize, and the tidal wave of proprietary scanners is starting to fill the closets of customs agencies. Everybody who's solving this problem is solving it in a siloed way. They're all shipping their own new scanner to every customs agency. This doesn't scale. And this we're just at the tip of the iceberg right here, right? Just a few organizations have started doing this, but there are thousands of organizations that need to do marking under international law, and each of those may have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of things out there in flight in the world at any given time. So what we really want is to have a single standard so that a customs agent can have a single scanner that can scan a standardized data format and present the information that right now they can see physically marked on something. That's really all this is about. Take the physical marking, have a standardized way that it can be read into a scanner and displayed on the back of the scanner. Next slide. So here's the structure. We have the issuer and the asset, which are both bound to the digital emblem by a bunch of records. And then we have a bunch of ways of distributing that data over to the validator who wants to check it out. So a QR code would be a passive optical marking. A active RFID transponder might be Bluetooth 4.0. In-band network response could be, you know, TLS options or something. Lots of ways that we've already standardized to move data around. We don't need to invent anything there. What's of interest here is that we get the binding defined such that it's sufficiently inclusive that we don't have multiple parties coming back and saying, oh, we need to start over from scratch because our use case is unique. People's use cases are not unique, right? People need to take a marking and show it on the back of a scanner, and the ICRC and sites and Ramsar, all these different bodies that are responsible for marking things, they just need to be able to replace a physical mark and ideally convey more information than just that physical mark does, and give non-repudiation, the ability to expire the mark, all these things. Next slide. Okay, so
there's 8 people in the queue.
Okay, all right. Then I'll just leave it at this.
I would like people who are not in the queue to ask a clarifying question to leave the queue because discussion is next. Anyway, yeah, so keep it really, really short.
Okay, shall I sit or am I responding? Okay, all right.
So Bill, thanks for the overview here of a bunch of the aspects of the problem. One thing I didn't see you cover was the authority scheme here. So who is authorized to bind these attributes to a thing, and how do the verifiers come to trust that they are authorized to do that? Is there any notion, a standard model for that in the cases you're talking about? And I'd be interested as well how that would compare to stuff like Sumit was talking about.
Okay, so this is just like all the rest of our protocols. The protocol is to facilitate communication. We don't gate who gets to use it. We don't say who gets to use HTTP to put up a website. The validator, the person who goes to look at the website, gets to figure out whether it actually represents the thing that they wanted to look at. So this is a communications mechanism between issuers and validators. Validators already have hundreds of years of experience in figuring out whether the issuer is somebody they care about or not. We have expertise that we can bring to bear in homographs and stuff. So having the digital cross signatures web of trust is really useful there, right? UNESCO might be cross-signed by the UN, whereas UNESCO would not be, right?
Hello, Watson Ladd, Akamai. It sounds from your presentation that you're assuming a situation where the organizations entitled to put up this emblem all have a certain degree of capability to maintain the keys, interact with an authorizing party. I think in the protective emblem case, we really do want organizations that are unable to do that to be able to use the emblem. Everyone who's actually entitled to use the emblem is entitled to use it, regardless of what, and there's no one who can really sign off on that. You just have to comply with those rules. Is that a big enough difference in your opinion to that maybe these are separate streams of work that should happen in different places and we won't have a solution for both of them?
Okay, so 2 quick answers to that. Number 1 is that under the law right now, what's required is a marking. A digital equivalent to that marking is a convenience, which nobody actually requires yet. That would be a next step. If people seem able to make this work, then the digital equivalent might not be such a big deal. And I think that the digital version is going to be way, way easier for a lot of people, including all the cryptographic stuff, so forth, than the paper is. Yep. All right. And I don't remember the other half. So I'll skip it.
Dennis Jackson, Mozilla. So I understood your presentation as focusing quite heavily on physical objects, shipping containers and so forth. I understood the ICRC's presentation as focusing exclusively on digital objects, services, and so on. Is your position that these are the same problem and can be addressed by the same technology? Or are these different problems in your view?
These are absolutely the same problem. Digital is a small subset of the marking problem. Marking a website, a mail server, digital data at rest, digital data in flight. The labels that comprise the emblem are the same regardless of whether it's that or a truck or a person or a building.
But the bindings are quite different.
The bindings are different for any of those, yes, but the information that you're trying to convey about them is what law are we talking about, where do you find it, who is the issuer, who has signed it, who are the cross signatures, what is the visual representation of the emblem. All that is exactly the same regardless, and we don't want to artificially break that up and make the same work be redone over and over for each constituency. That's not what we're about. We don't do HTTP for cat websites, HTTP for dating websites, and HTTP for real estate websites.
Thank you for clarifying your position.
Yeah, hi, this is Hank at the mic. I was stumbling in here under the impression that we are kind of helping the global society of doing the right thing and therefore helping critical infrastructure that is neutral all over the world to retain neutral and to present that also in the digital world. What I now saw is that we are doing product identification of physical objects, which is, to my understanding, an absolutely different out of scope problem statement that might end up with the same problem. With the same solution, of course, because you're kind of identifying physical objects. This is an ages-old problem, and there are QR codes, there are UPC codes, there's Aztec codes, there's so many codes, EAN, whatever, and they're all there. That is, I don't think, the problem. The problem is the unification. Again, I thought we were helping the Red Cross in a similar critical things here to be safe.
Is that a clarifying question?
No, that
please.
is, yes, I will sit down, but this is very different.
When we brought this to the IETF, the problem statement was...
Yes, and I have a clarifying question. So are you thinking that selective disclosure and device binding are in scope or out of scope for the problem?
In scope.
In scope?
Yes.
So like a wood pallet would be able to present device binding. I mean, that kind of, I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm trying to understand.
The digital emblem would present the information necessary for the validator to bind the digital emblem to the wooden pallet that they're looking
to
at.
keys maintained on the wooden pallet, essentially.
Sorry, to what?
To keys maintained on the wood. I mean, that's what device binding is.
Keys are
right?
not necessarily maintained on the
This
wooden
is
pallet.
clarifying question, right?
I get it.
I mean, device binding means very specifically that you can prove, cryptographically prove, that something belongs to a thing.
Right. So if you use the word binding as a term of art and you say that binding has to include cryptographic proof,
exactly.
then no, that's not how we're using the word binding.
So not necessarily device binding, but what about selective disclosure? Is that in scope or out of scope for this?
That is also in scope and is within what the implementers thus far have been doing.
All right.
But this is getting into the technology rather than the standard. Am I done?
One more.
Yeah, Mike Perrock here. Just quick clarifying, did you talk to any of the folks at like US Customs or UK Customs and Revenue or any of those folks that are already doing open standards, like actively testing how do we do this exact problem when building this out?
So we talked with the WCO, the World Customs Organization. We've talked with French Customs and Dutch Customs. We've not talked with US Customs. We've got a lead now to one of the people working in there. I know that they're doing a lot of work with the identity folks.
You could chase me down, or there's a couple other folks in this room. So
excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. We're now going to move on to the open mic section. This will be interesting. I ask that everyone be brief and try to maintain some, wow, that was fast. Maintain a focus on the goals for the session, which is to clarify what it is that this work would entail or would not entail. So with that, and whether, of course, this is the right place to do it and whether it's achievable and all those sorts of things. Warren, you know how this works.
So Warren Kamari, Google. So one of the things I do is I participate in the IETF NOC. And so we ship gear around all over the time. right? We ship stuff to different countries, etc. And so we're familiar with the Carnet process, and it's always a nightmare. Having that made easier would be great. I kind of disagree with Bill, though, that this is the same, like the ICRC and this problem are the same thing. To me, they seem fairly different, but it does seem like, the customs Carnet, here's a physical device, I want some way to figure out who made it, to authenticate it, is something that we could solve. It seems as though it shouldn't be that hard. I think it also kind of covers the journalist use case, journalists having to ship cameras and stuff. They could use this, but it sort of feels different to the ICRC. I want to protect this piece of digital infrastructure. Maybe the solution is the same, but to me, they seem quite different. I do think this is something the IETF can and should work on. Basically a way to sort of have a trust model and representation that you can attach to things. So, yep.
Hi, I'm Rowan May. So in another context, I worked as a humanitarian logistician between 2012 and 2019. I sent some slides, but very briefly, I think that humanitarians broadly would benefit very, very much from being able to solve several classes of problems. One of those related to customs clearing and paperwork, since often humanitarians don't send cargo directly from point A to point B. They often transit several other countries on the way. There's an example in my slides where we had to ship some gear from Obo, Central African Republic, to Yambio, South Sudan, distance of about 250 kilometers, and it ended up going about 7,000 to get there. The other useful things, for example, use case would be we often had refugee patients that needed to go across a checkpoint, and having an improved form of documentation for being able to take a patient to a hospital outside across one of those ceasefire lines or one of those refugee boundary areas would be very useful. And of course, humanitarians in the medical field are constantly sending around hazardous cargo and human tissue and blood samples. I also mentioned in my slides a couple of things that are not necessarily useful for the kind of humanitarian worker that I was. That doesn't mean that that may not be a useful solution for somebody else, but these markings, like the kind of markings that were discussed for white flag and the press, these do not always work. There's nothing magic about either the physical or the digital markings.
So
thank you very much.
So much for making those slides. Just to make them easy to find, I added them to the meeting materials so you can get them where the rest of the slides were.
All right, Leif Johansson. So scope. If you look at most countries today are busy rolling out digital wallet platforms that, if you look at the requirements for most of the stuff that's been presented today, would fit inside like any number of countries' existing digital wallet projects. So if you really are looking for solutions that involve all of the things that were presented today, you're going to look at a fairly complex digital identity ecosystem. And many of those are being built today. Several of them are being worked on in the IETF too. If this was a dispatch session, I'd probably be up here saying, have SPICE and Privacy Pulse sit down together and work this out, because that would you probably find like a lot of the solution space in those working groups, maybe with half of OAuth thrown in. You find most of the stuff you need. The problem is that I think Warren, I think there's such a massive difference between some of the stuff that's presented here. It's not clear that you're going to get to market fast enough if you actually try to pursue a very broad scope here, right? So I would say either the IETF actually needs to get its act together on digital identity once and for all and figure out what it actually wants to do, apply some architecture, and we'll see you in 10 years, maybe 15, right? Because that's how long it's going to take us to reinvent PKI, digital wallets, selective disclosure, privacy preserving, selective disclosure, et cetera, et cetera. But all of the crypto we need to reinvent, this is a long project, right? And the reason I can see your face, Bill, there's so much complexity in this, right? And there are people working on both supply chain aspects of this already in the IETF and personal digital identity who's probably in this room agreeing with me. This is a massive undertaking. Or scope it very, very narrowly and just look at like the Red Cross type use case and figure out a way to solve that and only that. I do one of those things. Otherwise, this is just going to be a fool's exercise, I think. Sorry? Exactly. That's like focus. Do that. Try to figure out what's separate, what's unique about that, and do that. I think that's a tractable problem
for the people, since it was not asked at the mic.
So Rowan said, do you mean to include the humanitarian use case? Ask a question today. Stephen Farrell. So yeah, I think this could get gigantic or it could be very small. I suspect immediately focusing on only the kind of Red Cross use case would seem wrong. I think including the humanitarian one in scope would seem right. Maybe the kind of customs related stuff. However, I really wonder, are ISO and other people not working on that? And if they are, then maybe it wouldn't make sense to happen here. I don't know the answer to that. I think before proceeding to include that, we probably should know that answer. If use cases for these things involve non-repudiation, it's going to get screwed up because we've tried to do that before and always failed. I don't see any evidence to say that we'd succeed this time if non-repudiation is required. So. But generally, I think helping the ICRC use case and the humanitarian one, and maybe the customs one, would make sense if other people aren't doing the customs one.
Mike Perrock here. A couple of clarifications on scope that I'm seeing, and then just a comment around use cases. So scope-wise, one thing, having worked on aspects of this problem in other areas, tend to see a lot of the personal identity type stuff get mixed up with system to system or corporate identity and trade type use cases. They have very distinctive requirements. A lot of times in the personal identity space, privacy really comes into play, and you want this ability to not, trace who's accessing what and things like that. Whereas a lot of times in the physical world, you actually do need very established, like traceabilities by design. You want to know exactly what's linked to what. And when those things get mixed up and tried to use on both sides, we tend to see a lot of problems. And so I would just say, like, we should be very clear, and I think Life was getting at this. Let's pick off one or two very simple things and maybe try to define maybe some credential types or vocabularies or claims for COSE, or Jose type, objects that might be helpful there. I would also note that I think the IETF is already working on large chunks of this, right? I think Spice, Skit have definite applicability, right? Skit's been looking just at the software supply chain side, I think officially to start, but obviously has applications in tracking a lot of these items. Spice for sure is looking very much at this. So if you want to look, actually in my slides I prepped earlier, looking specifically at eFIDO as an example of why some of these policy docs that are coming out of UN or ISO aren't actually working in terms of translating into the digital side, and how can we improve that? So there are aspects of this that I think are already the building blocks needed, and maybe we're just looking at a profile of some of those things IETF is already doing. So.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Farzan Abadi. And so I think that this is a laudable effort, and I would love to see that we can actually protect journalists on the ground when they're at war, and I would like to see refugee camps to be protected. And if we can somehow help through standardizing these logos and emblems, that is great. But I think that we need to have we need to come up with a scope. And also we need to be very clear what sort of effect this effort has on the affected community, if it actually helps them, if they want this. I mean, we are talking on their behalf at the moment. And if they wanted, what sort of requirement they need. And I think that it's definitely, I would love to see this happening at the IETF than ISO or other like ITU, that like ISO charges for standards and it's not very accessible. But for the digital infrastructure, especially when it comes to Red Cross, there have been efforts at ICANN by Red Cross to reserve domain names and to protect their intellectual property, which sometimes encroaches upon freedom of expression. So what I fear is that they use this standard and other elements and come to ICANN and say, well, words that have Red Cross in them, which they have done, Red Cross in them, they should be reserved. And also, they can also use this on websites that criticize Red Cross, that uses their logo somehow. They can go and they can say, the domain name should be taken down or it should not be hosted. So we need to also think about the accountability of these organizations and how that can affect, how the standardization can affect. It might not have an effect, but these are the risks that we should also consider. Thank you.
Just let Samit briefly, briefly respond.
Yeah, thank you so much for the chance to respond. Look, I'm not really sure what you're referring to. As I mentioned, the primary users of the emblem are not, it's not the ICRC. And when we talk about Red Cross, I mean, if you're talking about the movement, there's several different independent entities within the movement. There's the ICRC, there's the Federation, and there's all the different national societies, 191 national societies that are all independent from one another. So I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, and I don't know if we've been into IETF before, but to be honest, I don't think so. But in any case, yeah, there are important rules on misusing the emblem that come from international humanitarian law. So states actually have an obligation to ensure that the emblem is not misused. And the idea is that if everyone starts using the emblem, even if they're doing it for benign purposes, they're going to water down the meaning, and then parties to conflict wouldn't be able to identify what's protected or what's not. So I'm not really sure what you're referring to with regards to the websites, honestly, but as I mentioned, the main users of the emblems are actually like parties to conflict, so states and non-state parties.
Yeah, thank you. Next on the queue, we have someone called Invited Speaker 1, who has not identified themselves.
Yeah, I'm Moez Sekshuk. I'm speaking as a former UNESCO Assistant Director General. I followed the meeting, and this is my first time to participate to the IETF. So I can say that I just want to comment on the issue saying that the digital emblem match apply to just to other RCRC1 and all the Geneva Convention. I heard a lot of comments, but I want to really stress the importance of that there are many issues already when we talk about the digital emblem, the physical emblem that is covered by the Geneva Conventions. When you use them, and particularly the culture heritage emblem. So here I want to stress the importance of to cover different emblems and different use cases that were very well presented previously. I think that also we need to cover that in this standardization group, very important comments on to prevent any misuse. This is very important when you cover also arts objects to be identified. and to be protected, particularly in confluent zones or whatever said. And a lot of use cases, I want to really testimony that there is very important use cases that we can really showcase when we use digital emblems and not just the Red Cross emblems. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ted.
Thank you very much to the folks who brought the presentations to us today. I very much appreciate the clarifying comments that have come in. I realize being at the IETF, there's a lot of conflict. My apologies if that's been worrisome for you. It's just how we are. Listening through this, continue to think that there are distinguishable sets of problems here. And I understand Woody's perspective that one is a subset of the other, but it's a subset with some technical characteristics which are quite different, I think, particularly in the ability to inspect covertly and the ability to bind and unbind very quickly that relate to both the humanitarian use case for the press badges and or the ability to detect that somebody has a medical role at a distance. And I think those are really some of the most challenging things that would be tackled by the IETF if it takes on this work. And I think as a result, those need to be kind of the focus of a working group. I don't see any reason why we can't have two outputs from this, one of which is working on a broad problem and one of which is working on a narrow one. I agree that there would be some value if they happen to be able to reuse some of the same building blocks, but I'm strongly of the opinion that they can't collapse into a single use case given some of the unique properties that have been brought out for the humanitarian and Red Cross use case. So I'm definitely in favor of the IETF continuing to discuss the work and hopefully taking it up, but probably in two streams. Thank you.
Hi, folks. This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore from the ACLU. Sorry that I'm not there in person. I echo what Ted said about the scopes being pretty different and needing to be working in different places. And I want to also just highlight that I think we need to think about how a system like this could potentially be misused as well. Even a thing that is voluntarily applicable, like you can add it or remove it. You could imagine a party to a conflict saying, well, especially if we're completely agnostic in how we design this about who the authorities are, you can imagine a party to a conflict saying, well, we'll set up an authority, we'll make these badges, we'll put them on all of our guys, and we don't care whether you know about them or not, and we'll block all other digital infrastructure that doesn't happen to have one of these badges. That's just one example of a way that a badging scheme like this could potentially be used for sort of large-scale social control or knocking people off of the network as an allow list filter for participation on the network. So I just want to flag that that's something we need to be thinking about if we move forward in any of these spaces. Thanks.
Thank you, Elliot here. Okay, just a couple of comments. First, I think we're going rather fast in terms of people essentially jumping to opinions on what I think was a relatively short set of presentations. And while we have we've had a few discussions online, one of the things that occurs to me is that we really need to decompose the problems yet more in order to understand where those commonalities are. I think Ted may be right that there's some stuff that's reusable. I sort of like the variable bindings, using Bill's terminology that he put up there. Maybe those are separate efforts or similar efforts. The discussion about customs, I'll just add, obviously Cisco has an interest in that. We ship products all over the world. I don't know the applicability of this work yet to that. And we have some people who are expert at Cisco who we can bring in if that becomes the focus of the work. So my only concrete suggestions for next steps here, this is the sort of thing that I would have expected would be either good to delve into in sort of an IAB program approach, right? Or a workshop where we have more time and maybe even a little bit of preparatory time to really do that deep dive to figure out where those, what are the building blocks we have that we can use, to address which problems, and where the commonalities are within the problem space and where the commonalities are between the solution space, because we don't like building too many building blocks. So thanks for giving me the time.
So thanks to the organizers for a very clear presentation. In terms of the usual BOF questions, I think we do have a worthwhile problem here that is clearly scoped and within the capabilities of the IETF. From a technical sense, I feel like there's basically two facets to each of the kind of use cases presented. There's credential structure and formats and how you make the statements of the attributes you're trying to assert. And then there's a presentation protocol problem. I feel like especially in the cyber protection of cyber assets question, that question of how you present a credential in the context of whatever interaction a cyber operator is having with a cyber asset, that's very much, the protocols by which the operators and assets are interacting are largely IETF protocols, and so it's very natural for the IETF to attack that problem. I think Ted, it was probably right in terms of two work streams emerging from this. I think it would be good to get to the next level of detail in the requirements for the credential formats and what they would look like in those two cases. It may even be that there's two fairly distinct sets of stakeholders in those two, vendors and customs officials on the one hand, NGOs and cyber operators on the other hand. So I think it's likely that we end up with two work streams here, but I agree that this is a problem that the IETF can work on.
Watson.
Watson, Ladd, Akamai. I'll be brief. I think there is a real world need for the protective emblem use case. It's narrowly scoped. It has unique constraints that other use cases don't, that the protocol needs to accommodate. And I think the IETF can and should work on it. The need is now. We've already seen state-sponsored attacks go out of control and hit humanitarian assets in other uninvolved countries.
Hi, Stu Card, primarily active in the Drone Remote Identification Protocol, or DRIP working group. We clearly recognize that identification and recognizing an emblem are two different problems. However, the minute you want that emblem to be strongly authenticatable and have non-repudiation, I don't know how to do it without specific identification. We also face the problem of being able to see this drone's ID at a distance, even when the observer was offline and thus unable to consult the internet for rich information about the identified entity, but we could still do trust classification at a distance, even when offline. And I just want to read one line from RFC 9153, our DRIP requirements. DRIP could be applied to verifiably identify other types of registered things reported to be in specified physical locations. So I would just encourage that if we do proceed with this, that we look there at some of the sub-problems that we may have solved there. Thank you.
Paul Wouters speaking as individual. I've heard the term digital asset mentioned a number of times, and I think people have widely different opinions on what that actually means. I've heard someone say that a hard disk containing patient files on a hospital server is a digital asset. That's generally not how IETFers think of a digital asset. They think more about public keys, IP addresses, networks. So I think we should clarify that a bit better in any future charter. And the second point is that I hear a lot about sort of physical supply chain things, and I think there are some working groups already around the IETF. There's industry outside the IETF working on there. I don't hear much about the actual identifying networking part, and that's where I thought we were actually going with this. It's like, which networks are used for the hospital, and make sure that you don't take out these network elements. So I'm a little confused about the physical versus the digital framework of this conversation.
Scott Fleur, Cisco Systems, most certainly not one of the experts that Elliot Lear just referred to. A very quick question, and it's probably pretty obvious, but I thought I'll ask it anyways. One of the things that Cisco is concerned about is using digital emblems to detect counterfeits. Is that in scope or out of scope?
So the chairs are not going to answer that question, but I hope some of the people at the mic line will.
Okay.
Chris Rishak speaking for myself. I did have questions about the scope. I think many of the others in the line have already mentioned it. I would personally be in favor of having more of a narrow scope in the beginning, as opposed to starting off very widely. That'll help us focus and address the specific properties before we decide how wide we want to go.
Jonathan Hoyland, Cloudflare, but speaking as an individual. I think thinking that digital assets are going to be more visible in a war zone when we've already seen that there's huge amounts of jamming that goes on in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I think they may actually be less visible. And imagine, you know, I've got some loitering munition that's trying to scan a QR code on some car, go to the internet, fetch some rich data, decide whether or not to bomb this car. Like, I feel like that's less reliable than just looking. There is also a significant risk of ransomware operators going like, oh, I found this hospital. This is a really good idea. Let's go ransomware this hospital because I know they're really critical and they're going to pay me lots of money. So it's not obvious that this is even a good idea at all. Hospitals have been, well, at least in the UK, have definitely been paying off ransomware operators, which, you know, makes them more likely to be targeted. I don't understand whether the ask is, how do we deliver data in a standardized format, or is it decide what data is needed by a customs agent? I think those are two very different problems, and from the presentations, it's not clear which one we're trying to solve, or both, or neither, or...
Kalia.
I want to echo what Mike Prorock and Leaf said. There's work that is quite aligned with what I understand, at least the goals around physical markings already happening in the verifiable credentials and related communities. I put several links into the Zulip chat pointing at that work, and it's already being referenced in UN trade policy and implementation documents, and there's already code out there. And I think I'd warn and caution that identity is really hard, which I imagine many people in this room already know. And I do think this work has a place here. Just make sure it connects with existing work that already is solving these problems.
Yeah, hi, Felix Linker. So I just wanted to comment on the notion that the scope as presented by Bill is a superset of the work that as presented by me. I think there's certainly an overlap. Being a bit provocative, it's the same overlap that we have, no, not yet provocative. It's the same overlap that we have with work from working groups like SPICE. So yes, there will be an issuer, all these things related to message content. I think the unique problems to solve, though, will be distribution. And we will certainly use a lot of work from working groups like SPICE. I'm not an expert there. We will profile probably credentials formats and all that, but I don't think there's any work to be done really in finding a common set of claims or the likes. Yeah, so distribution, I think, really sets us apart. And thanks.
Thanks, Felix. Hi, Nick.
Nick Doty, Center for Democracy and Technology. Thanks to all the presenters. I'm seeing lots of interesting work and interesting overlap. And I'm grateful for the identity folks that have already spoken, as I think the three-party model and issuers and verifiers may be particularly useful for some of the paperwork and physical asset use cases. I also think we can find productive work for the IETF that is not a single use case, but we can usefully cluster use cases that might be similar, that there are going to be multiple use cases and multiple emblems that care about cyber attack type situations. That might be a good way to start work. That certainly would apply to the Red Cross, but not just the Red Cross, but wouldn't get us into trying to solve all of the problems in a single in a single working group. So I hope we'll look at the SPICE and other work where we can, and I also think we should try to cluster use cases where we can.
All right, Richard.
Very good. Thank you, Rick Wilhelm, Public Interest Registry. We're the registry operator for .org. We're the home of many, many nonprofit and mission-driven organizations, one of which is the International Red Cross. Thank you. But there are also over 10 million other nonprofit and mission-driven organizations, about 10.9 if you're keeping count. This sort of digital emblem would be very, very important for nonprofit organizations that use the internet for fundraising and all sorts of other important outreach activities. As this audience is presumably aware, these sorts of organizations are frequently subject to impersonation attacks on their websites through all sorts of things, whether it be direct hijacking of their websites or impersonation email attacks where people send out emails that look like they're from the organization, but they really aren't. These kinds of things happen whenever there's fundraising, things that are crisis-driven, all sorts of humanitarian crises, natural disaster crises, or as we saw, even digital problems with software distributions, as happened over the past weekend. As it relates to the digital side of the problem and the physical side of the problem, I think that the digital use case and the physical use case might be closer than some people might initially think. Sort of like QR codes brought URLs into the real world in a much different way than a lot of us in the room probably thought 10 to 15 years ago. There might also be some analogy to the world of IoT. Bill might have already thought this through. I don't know. I didn't grab him for a coffee before this meeting. Regardless, we at PIR are supportive of this going forward for the end user's sake, most importantly, and the end users of the end users, which is the general population of the internet, who is the one who's going to have their money, their donations pinched if they go to the wrong website and don't make a donation where they think they're going. Thank you.
So we have less than a minute left for discussion. If per person who's in line, keep it short, please.
Okay, I'll be brief. I think Jim Reed, the general idea I think here of working on the initial problem that was suggested with digital emblems for the, broadly speaking, the humanitarian use case, I think is something that the IETF could work on relatively quickly because it's fairly clearly identified and the scope is somewhat constrained. The bigger issues that Bill talked about, I think, are fascinating, and I would like to see the IETF work on them, but I have a feeling we might be biting off more than we can chew, because at that stage we're going to have to interact with a lot of international agencies, World Trade Center, all sorts of other, the World Trade Organization, International Labour Organization, Maritime Organization, aviation organizations. I think that problem could become intractable. And then in that case, how we actually interact with those institutions could be quite difficult. And I think it'd be very hard, for example, for some of these people to come and take their turn at the mic at an IETF meeting, which might be another thing that would actually make that work much more difficult to achieve a suitable end goal. Thanks.
Hi, Alex Rosenberg, first IETF meeting, although I've done some work in ISO. I'm looking at implementing some of this stuff, and really what I'm looking for is a clear data model that is perhaps hierarchical and has attestation wrapping around it, perhaps layers of attestation to handle logistics companies and things like that involved. An emblem is just to me a blob in that data set. And I think that's the standard to be looking at there is what is a standard for some kind of data that describes a thing, a virtual or real or person, and you let following standards add on to that as additional RFCs for different specific use cases. Thanks.
Alyssa Cooper. So I definitely am supportive of all the people who said to narrow this. It seems like a little boil the ocean listening to all of it. And I think the other reason to do that is because it's kind of unclear whether there will, on balance, be a ton of benefit from this, just because of kind of the issues with ultimately being able to trust whatever's being signaled. I think in particular on the In the cyber attack case, one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is the contested nature of attribution of the source of cyber attacks. So that's one thing that makes me feel like maybe this isn't going to be that useful, because there's already a tremendous amount of debate of who was actually responsible for many, many cyber attacks. So whether you could hold them accountable because what they attacked was covered by an emblem, I think is like a really big open question. And then finally, it seems like there's also a real risk of kind of creating perverse incentives here a little bit. I mean, this notion that you signal this emblem and then so the MRI machines in a war zone don't get attacked, but all the medical devices in every other emergency room are fine to be attacked. That doesn't really seem like a place where we want to end up with this, but it seems like something that could be concluded. So I have some pause about kind of sending those signals.
Peter Koch speaking for myself. I'm still struggling with the size, scale, and scoping questions, and with the alleged equivalence of the problems presented. And thanks to all the presenters for actually presenting challenging new tasks. In terms of parallelism of work or duplication with other standardization efforts, I would be interested to understand how this broader thing, the broader challenge, is equivalent and where it's different from what the European Union promotes under the digital product pass, including circular economy and anything like that. That might be a bit large for the IETF to tackle alone, and at least there would be parallel efforts to probably synchronize with. Thank you.
Bob Moskowitz. There are probably thousands of globally unique digital identity efforts going on right now. I'm personally involved in a few of them. I think they can, though, grouped into two type of things: those with computing capability and those without computing capability. For us to do anything worthwhile, we need to put a layer of abstraction in like this, that how we talk about it in terms of these things, so that we can be effective across the board. So there's still not the 1,000 different efforts going on worldwide to solve this digital identity effort. So if we can, in terms of how we scope this, if we can then scope it in terms of large groupings in this way, and then how we approach the problem. And I'd be very interested in helping that, because like I said, I'm involved in a few of them right now, and would love to see how we can solve this on a broad basis. So that's my cut on this, and that's my time.
Dennis Jackson. I really like the energy in the room to solve these problems. I hear a lot of enthusiasm for narrowing the scope. I think the first obvious cut is between physical or digital. And my view is that they shouldn't be in the same working group. They are far too broad. So I'm not saying don't do one or the other, but I'm saying don't try to do both at once. The second axis to cut along is the use case in terms of international law or any other area of application. I think the ICRC's use case, where they steward something that is used widely all over the world, is broad enough to be compelling. It has many different people that need to both issue and consume those tokens. And it has a clear mandate and a clear set of existing requirements, which means that it can be worked on productively. I'm much less convinced that's the case for some of the other areas. And I think a useful distinction is whether we have stakeholders in the room that can speak to those kind of legal requirements and help us translate them into a technical standard. That's essential for good progress.
I'll talk fast and I have a timer. So quick note, Warren Kumari speaking as an individual, and I'm not actually the DIEM buff, that's Eric. So I mean, I think everybody would love to help with the humanitarian thing, right? It's clear and obvious, a good thing to do, but I don't really see how a lot of these sort of proposals actually help with that. Things like a protective mark that doesn't need authorization for someone to use, like I'm a medical person, that's just a signed blob, right? Like ICRC can sign this blob and people can then use it if they don't need authorization. And if they do need some sort of authentication or attestation, then that's just somebody cross-signs your certificate. And that's also something that's solved. As Jonathan said, like these aren't the problems. The problem is, how do you communicate this to somebody? If you're in a conflict zone and you drive up in your vehicle to a checkpoint, You're not going to pull out your RFID and be like, please read this before you shoot me. That's not really helpful. I think a much more useful and tractable thing that we could solve is sort of the physical thing. Like, this is a pallet of plasma or antibiotics being shipped from this hospital to this particular location. I think it's a much more reasonable thing. It's something that we can sort of understand. It's something that is implementable relatively easily and doesn't require some way to sort of like broadcast your information everywhere, which I think is outside our scope. And there's my time.
Tommy Jensen, Microsoft. I do think that there's valuable work here to proceed. I think that it should be grouped, as others have said, into actionable scopes. One being, there seem to be a large group of the covert, and like, it's okay that you inspect it. You don't need to hide the fact that you're inspecting it in the non-humanitarian case, right? The shipping containers, the customs borders. Digital emblems on physical assets that are actively being inspected being one set, and another being humanitarian law protected where inspection needs to be covert. Whatever that thing it's labeling is technically unique. And I don't separate it because of the parties involved, but because it brings up a whole different set of problems that ought to be considered independently. I think those two groups should collaborate, and I do think there will be opportunities for data formatting, but the conveyance is so different. I think we should proceed with both.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for the work. I wanted to come in on a couple points that I think IETF has, it could be an interesting area of work for the IETF, right? There's been, ICRC's identified this gap, and that there would be many, many implementers who would fulfill that. So lots of vendors, lots of folks who are hosting these kinds of organizations with these kinds of digital assets, however you want to define that. And those would be the implementers. But yes, it is kind of originating from one place. And that's because the ICRC are the stewards of this kind of emblem, as it is very, very specially, and I want to lean into this really hard, it is super special that this emblem at all exists. It's in the Geneva Convention. It isn't sort of just an idea out there. It is actually very special. And one thing that I think hasn't necessarily been brought up or maybe elaborated enough is, you know, we know attacks exist. We know that can happen. This doesn't prevent that. This is not a security feature, right? But what can happen is that when attacks happen in real life, right, you wind up in the International Criminal Court, or you wind up in the Human Rights Council during a universal periodic review talking about states who have violated these norms and these conventions. And right now, there is no way to prove that that happens when it's an online attack. And this would change that. Thanks.
Tobias Siewich, Max Planck Institute for Informatics, speaking for myself. I would like to remind the room that there are no technical solutions for social and societal problems. And it feels a bit like we're trying to do that, which I can understand, because if engineers see a problem that seems to be simple enough, they will always start going. And I already see the first planks being brought for a bike shed in the chat. I believe that if at all, this should be at the IRTF to figure out what problem we're actually trying to solve.
Is it my time? Okay, yeah. I think we established there's a ton of problem statements here, but everything that's under Article 79 of the Geneva Convention or under Resolution 2222 of United States Council, that's something we can solve here, address here, because it's the right thing to do. I heard digital product passport before, and I'm kind of working for 2 decades in the identifying of physical objects in supply chains. That's an absolutely related but very master problem statement thing. And what I just heard from Tobias also is like cut up problem statements into digestible things. And the humanity thing, I think someone said, I think should be the first.
So earlier I made a mistake and bumped Casey out of the queue. And so I'd like to give him a chance to speak now.
Sorry about that. I was wondering how that happened. Casey DCO, I just had a few thoughts in response to some comments that were made and observations that I've made. First of all, I appreciate all the speakers and the input that's been given. And I think this is a very real problem, both the digital and the physical aspect of things. I do see the need for both aspects. I personally don't see a problem with including both of those in the charter, but part of the way of dealing with that could be dealing with bite-sized chunks, even if that means addressing both things separately as both parts of a charter. I do see a need, as others have mentioned, to see what else is being done. I know I've heard others mention tapping into various resources, including other standards bodies and other organizations that are doing similar things like U.S. Customs, other working groups, ISO. And so uniting efforts, I think, is very real in defining what else needs to be done and how to utilize existing tools. Somebody mentioned that this could be a very long project. I agree with that. On the other hand, I also think that it's very important to recognize that this can be done in chunks, can be prioritized, and the things that need to go out there can be the first. We can put first things first in terms of a charter, and that's what I wanted to say about that. Thank you.
Okay, so sorry, Ron. we closed the queue a long time ago. So Eric, we'd like you to join us on stage for the last part here. Eric. So the question that's left for the last 10 minutes is whether this is the right place to do the work and whether we should be working on a charter. And so I'm going to turn it over to our sponsoring area director for that.
Yeah, so first, very thank you for everyone participating in the discussion, right? It was not easy to chair, not easy to swallow all the information we received. Obviously, it was a non-working group forming both, and for good reason. As you know, the next step is to discuss with ISG, IAB, and maybe other stakeholders to see what we will do next. I don't have a predefined answer right now. And Martin, you disagree with what I said.
So I think it might be responsible of us to sort of summarize some of the things that we heard from people in the room. There seems to be a number of use cases that people are interested in that covers a fairly broad spectrum of things. Some people have identified some commonalities from a technical perspective, but there are also pieces to that potentially are complicated and could require a large amount of work. And the work that we have in front of us from here is to identify those pieces that have a narrow enough scope and also have a broad enough applicability that we can turn them into units of work that we understand and can all agree on. That's going to be a little challenging in this case. There's a lot of different use cases, but I think that we now have a better understanding of where people are, the sorts of use cases that they're contemplating. We have a bunch of people in the room who have familiarity with the tools that we're building in other working groups in the IETF, and I expect that we should have a productive discussion about how we can structure the work. And yes, there may at some point be a discussion with the ISG, but I'm not sure that we're quite at the point where we can really give the ISG something to take at this stage.
Yeah, we are far away from this point. Agreed.
Yeah.
So I think the next big steps happen on the mail list where we start proposing chunks of a charter, right? What work is appropriate for the IETF and see if we can get consensus that we have enough people who are willing to pick up the pen, do reviews, and do code. I see a lot of nodding.
Stick your hands up if you're willing to work on this topic, just to give us a sense. Yeah, I think that's pretty compelling. That may be too many hands to actually be successful.
Sorry, if I can just do an AD override, like, please, let's remember we have remote participants, so let's enfranchise them if we're going to do straw polling.
Right. I was just trying to get a bit of a sense here, but thanks, Roman, for reminding that. I will put that to a question in mid-echo and give you plenty of time to answer.
Yeah. Eric, and then
when doing the charter, we assume that we'll be working on a single charter. I start to think that we may want to get 2 charters for 2 working groups. That's an open option.
That's okay if that's the outcome.
Exactly.
If it starts getting bipolar, then but we need to have a draft to discuss in the next IETF. Go ahead.
Hi, Rowan May. So on both in the discussions and on the chat, I heard and saw a lot of conflation between humanitarian use cases, the ICRC, Geneva Convention defined distinctive emblem. That has a very special meaning. Don't use it unless that's what you mean. And between the uses by humanitarians and press people for protection versus for other uses. And so please, when you have these discussions on the mailing list or in the chat, please be specific about which ones of these you mean. Thank you.
Yeah, so part of our responsibility here is to establish some of that common language, and thanks for clarifying that, Ron. I would appreciate it if you sent a mail to the mailing list with something of a taxonomy of terms as you understand them, and we can get that down.
Is the mailing list up already?
The mailing list is DIEM at IETF.
Okay. I was just going to quickly suggest that the proponents take the opportunity to figure out if there is a way to do a side meeting in one of the side meeting slots this week to try to get some more detailed feedback from the identity community. It's like a massive 9-dimensional Kinder egg of requirements.
Yeah, only 9? Alyssa.
I think this question is kind of meaningless given the like breadth of the different use cases that were discussed today and the number of people who came up here and said like yours is interesting but that one isn't, and or like are these subsets of each other or not. So like the people who want to defend their counterfeit Cisco goods, like if the ultimate charter that you use to create that working group, like does that have anything to do with the people who want to protect the press? Maybe it does, but it was kind of unclear. So I'm not sure what you're learning from this question.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm getting at here either. And that is really the result of the BOF right there.
I hear lots of interest, but less specificity, right? And we're going to have to narrow that down on the mail list because we're not going to do it in the remaining 2 minutes.
Yeah, and just to come on the mailing list, there were many people that are here for just one day to attend this BOF. I hope they will keep engaged into the mailing list and the discussion further. Please don't be a one-shot.
Very good point.
And shot is basically the wrong word to use, by the way.
Quick clarifying question. I know it was brought up like 1, maybe 2 charters. Is a possible outcome that we just identify, maybe there's a couple of drafts that might fit within an existing working group, because there are working groups that are covering like chartered specifically around this area already, just more broadly.
Please point them out. Yes. Okay. It's been an interesting morning, and I'm sure there will be a lot of hallway conversation after. So thank you very much for your attention.